I'm Melanie Ramdarshan Bold, one of the programme coordinators, and I am super delighted to be here today to chair this panel with these most excellent group of writers. So we have writer and academic Darren Chetty, a contributor to the best-selling book, The Good Immigrant, edited by Nikesh Shukla, and co-author of What is Masculinity? Why Does It Matter? And Other Big Questions with Jeffrey Boakye, and How to Disagree with Adam Ferner. Hi, Darren. We have Merky Books' inaugural signing, writer and poet Derek Owusu, author of That Reminds Me, the editor of Safe on Black British Men Reclaiming Spaces, sneaky infiltrator into English literature lectures at the University of Manchester, and as of tonight, the winner of the 2020 Desmond Elliott Prize. And finally, writer, photographer, and broadcast journalist Johny Pitts, winner of multiple awards, including the Jallock Prize 2020 for his book Afropean, Notes from Black Europe, which has now been translated into multiple languages. So just to give you an overview, the main aim of the discussion tonight and the main aim of the programme is to make a space for Black and other writers of colours to discuss the craft of writing non-fiction that is both literary and socially relevant. Darren, Derek and Johny will talk about their writing practices, authorship experiences and how they are using non-fiction to advocate for change. So we're going to start with a panel discussion and then open it up for audience questions at the end. But please feel free to join the conversation with questions and comments in the chat function and also on Twitter using our Take Flight Hub hashtag. So just a bit of housekeeping to enable us to distinguish what is a question and what is a comment. Can I ask you to put your comments, your questions in all caps, like you're shouting them at us, basically. And do remember to make use of the, to make sure the question is put to everyone rather than individuals in the chat function, just because it's easier to monitor. And just a wee reminder that the webinar is being recorded. Okay, so to begin, Darren, Derek and Johny, and maybe we could start in that order. How did you begin writing and in general and writing non-fiction specifically?
Yes, well, I guess for me, writing in as much as it is a career, and it's certainly not bringing me in a lot of money right now, but it would be a second career. I was a primary school teacher for 20 years. And in that time, I was always keen on writing and would often try and write pieces, I guess, what would broadly be termed action research, sort of reflecting on classroom, reflecting on school. But I wasn't sort of writing and trying to get published in any major way. But I guess my earliest sort of interest in writing was in the 80s around hip hop, when I was a very mediocre rapper. But it was the one time when I was actually writing and I had, a sense of writing for an audience. Whereas everything I wrote in school just felt very much like, well, you've got to get this done to get a grade, and to a more greater or lesser extent, sort of devoid of meaning. So writing really about teaching and education was my way in, I guess. Then writing a piece for Media Diversified, the platform which is no longer in existence, but did a lot, I think, to promote writers of colour, and that led to being invited to contribute to The Good Immigrant, which had a good, has allowed me to do sort of more commercial writing, the academic writing, and I guess I'm trying to do academic writing that can be read by everyone, and commercial writing that is, to some extent research informed.
Johny, Derek, do either one of you want to jump in?
I can join in. I can't hear you, Derek, at the moment. Sorry if I talked over you there. I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, I'm an idiot. Sorry. Yeah. No, go ahead, Johny. Go ahead, Johny.
No, go on. We said Darren, Derek, and then Johny. So you go next. That's cool.
Okay, cool. So I was saying that my story is very similar to Darren's. Actually, I got into writing because of grime music. I grew up in kind of like the golden age of grime music, where everybody wanted to be a grime artist or a rapper. And the problem I had was that I had too much to say, so I couldn't fit what I wanted to say into a bar. I would always go over, so I was completely off flow all the time. And then that led into me kind of writing poetry just quietly to myself. But how I got into writing nonfiction, again, is similar to Darren. I wrote something for Media Diversified. They gave me the opportunity to write something for them, and it landed pretty well. And then from there, I just kind of continued. I wrote a few things for Media Diversified, and then I managed to write a successful pitch for Save, thanks to journalist and author Yomi Adegoke, who actually helped me find my voice in writing. Because before I met her, I was kind of writing how I thought people wanted me to sound. But she said to me, just write how you actually sound and it will be fine. And yeah, so that's how I got into writing nonfiction.
Yeah, the risk of this getting boring. I'm from a similar tradition as both Darren and Derek. In fact, I think it's quite interesting how Darren emerges from 80s hip hop culture. I suppose I emerge from 90s hip hop culture, and Derek emerges from what I think of as noughties hip hop culture, which is grime. And I think grime underpins the sound of hip hop right now. So yeah, really, as school was failing me, hip hop was a place. It was like a second education in lots of ways. I don't want to be too romantic about hip hop either, because there were moments where I was sort of had this obsession with getting shot. Like I thought it was quite a glamorous thing. But then ultimately I was amazed by the lyricism and the knowledge of a lot of those MCs that came through in the 90s, especially MCs like Mos Def and Talib Kweli, who for me, it's amazing. I think Talib Kweli's brother teaches law at Stanford or something, and I think in Talib Kweli we have a Stanford lawyer as an MC. We have somebody who has that level of sort of knowledge of the system, but always brings it to the streets. And I suppose that's how I describe what I'm trying to do with my writing, is to try and always honor the place that I grew up, while also trying to, I suppose, like Darren said, never forgetting to be challenging and not to dumb myself down either. And actually, I think my writing really emerges. I've always been a writer, I think, as long as I can remember. But I think I only started doing it in earnest in a lost period of my life after quitting college and having a sort of a year or two dossing around Sheffield, working a part-time job and getting sacked from the job, and then sort of this weird lost phase of sort of dossing around for a couple of years. And a lot of the mood of the mood of my writing really emerges even now from this sort of lost couple of years where I was trying to find myself and tapping in to the sort of everyday, the everyday of my life.
That's really interesting. I think I want to go back to a point that you made, Derek, about finding your voice. I mean, how did each of you begin to find your voice, and also to what extent do you have an audience in mind when you're writing? Derek, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. No, I don't have an audience in mind. I kind of imagine that you begin to have an audience in mind the more successful you become. I think that when you're starting out and you're just writing, you're more likely to be writing for yourself, because you have no idea how many people are going to read what you're writing. So I think, yeah, no, I don't have a person when I'm writing nonfiction anyway. I don't have an audience in mind. I just kind of write I guess I try and put down what I'm thinking onto the page. It never lands the way you think it's gonna land when it comes out of your head. But Oh yeah, I don't think I don't think I've ever thought about an audience when I was writing, except for maybe one non-fiction piece that I wrote for Media Diversified, and that was because I was trying to, I guess, kind of connect with other British Ghanaians who had had the same experience that I had. I think that's probably the only time that I've ever written something and had an audience in mind.
I could jump in there perhaps, just so we don't all sit in silence.
I thought we had frozen.
Yeah, it's a question that fascinates me, I guess, because of my teaching background as well. I've always been interested in sort of what writers say about writing, and you know, whether you can teach creativity and how you teach writing, etc. And it seems that writers are really, you know, sort of split on this idea of having an audience in mind, because there's always this worry that if you have an audience in mind, well, what you're really doing is sort of pandering to that audience, giving the people what they want, or thinking, well, if I produce this, it'll sell enough that it's worth doing. But I think at the same time that it's quite something to not have any kind of audience, and to be writing for something that interests you, with the assumption that if it interests you, it interests other people. And maybe I'm getting towards that point, but certainly I think in my earliest writing, there was a very much a sense of me having to thinking I had to persuade people that what I had to say was important. So I guess it's that sort of thing, and particularly because I'm also doing academic writing at the same time, that you're trying to convince a slightly skeptical audience that this stuff matters. But I think increasingly I'm not as bothered about the people. Some of the things I write, you know, I know there's a whole bunch, because I'm on Twitter, who would just reject everything I'm saying. And I guess if I'm writing something that's useful to those people who may be engaged in similar projects, then that's probably a good enough thing in itself. That, you know, when some people occasionally say, oh, that really helped me to articulate something I'd thought about or felt, but not quite, you know, put into words. So I guess for me, that more than the audience, I think I like to have a sort of question that my PhD supervisor is always asking, which is, what is at stake here? And I think if having a sense of, if I know there's something's at stake, that's going to motivate me. And then it's a kind of act of faith that there will be others who also think this matters, rather than trying to persuade everyone that it does, I guess.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like a 3-tier process. I almost always write the first draft of anything for myself. I follow my whims. I get very indulgent. My prose is very florid and colourful. And then I write the second draft for my community. So I hone it in. I say, how can this benefit the people I grew up with? Will they understand it? And then the third draft I write for my enemy. And by enemy, I mean like good and bad enemies. So for instance, a good enemy might be like my peers or people I admire, where they'll pull me up for any bullshit. You know, they'll be like, that's what you're saying there's whack or whatever. And then there's also, you know, am I, you know, Nigel Farage? What's Nigel Farage going to say to try and demean or reject what I'm saying? And how can I fight against that, you know, before it's even happened? So it's this three-tier process of first draft for self, second draft for community, third draft for enemy.
Third draft for Nigel Farage specifically.
Not exactly, but yeah.
So Derek, I thought it was really interesting that you said that especially that when you're writing non-fiction you don't write for an audience, but perhaps when you're writing fiction you might. And I know that all of you write different types of, you know, different types of writing, but centering specifically on this kind of personal essay, literary nonfiction. What do you think the main pros and cons have been in writing this type of work? Johny, do you want to, or Derek?
No, Johny can go. I'm just still thinking about it.
Yeah, Johny, you go, and then Derek, you can go after.
Okay, the main pros and cons of writing about your own experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's sort of, I would say it's the mendacity of friends and loved ones. What's something that really surprises me is that is how much trouble the truth can get you in. So like when I thought the whole point of writing is to tell the truth. And then when you tell the truth, you realize, well, A, is that there are many truths and that people see things very differently, people who went through the same experience that you did. But then secondly, is that even when it's an objective truth, even when what I'm saying is exactly what happened and I know it, sometimes people, even those close to you, don't like to hear it. And one of the things, I mean, my dad passed away in December, but one of the things that initially took me by surprise was how my dad had a very different idea about what my life was like growing up, and was sometimes insulted with some of the things that I was saying. This is in my early nonfiction, so that was a surprise, and also thinking actually sometimes maybe you don't, maybe you do have to look after your loved ones, and in Afropean, for instance, I'm glad that I learned that lesson, because there were certain people who I grew up with that I write about in the book, and I gave them pseudonyms to protect their identity, and I think that can be important.
Derek, do you want to?
Sorry, I was on mute again. Yeah, I definitely agree with Johnny. With my kind of my essay in the Safe collection, my parents were they weren't disappointed, but they were kind of surprised that that's how I saw things when I was growing up. Even though you do talk to them about these things, I guess it just shows they're never really listening until they see it on paper. And so, yeah, you get in trouble with those kind of things. Also, for me personally, because I write fiction and nonfiction, when I write nonfiction, one of the cons is that I give away information that I could have fictionalized and put in like a novel or like a poem or something like that. And because fiction is my main focus, that's definitely a con. But then it's kind of like you need to write what you need to write. So, but yeah, other than that, I don't feel like the cons are too bad. I think I'm quite used to a kind of, in terms of like personal essays anyway. I'm used to wearing my heart on my sleeve. I think with nonfiction as well, the criticism doesn't hit as hard. I think that's a good thing. It does, for me personally, it doesn't hit as hard because you're literally just writing about something that is true. It's in the world. Do you know what I mean? You haven't had to use too much of your imagination, so you can never really take it personally. That's how I feel anyway. You can never really take it personally. So that's a pro for that. But yeah, in terms of the cons, that's it for me.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in the politics of the personal essay, and it strikes me that there's some real positives in suddenly putting yourself into the story. You know, I sometimes think of it as sort of writing my way into the story I've written about growing up in Wales, and that felt like I was suddenly, you know, in relationship to this place that when I was actually there were all kinds of ways that I wasn't part of it. So I think there's something powerful, and I think Johnny does that brilliantly in Afropean, if I may say, that it's a really detailed research piece of writing. It's not simply, you know, him sort of reflecting on himself. I hope you don't mind me talking about you like this, Johnny. but it's clearly written by someone who themselves is part of the group of people that's been explored. I'm going to put it like that. So this old style of essay writing, which was this sort of pretend view from nowhere, this pretend neutral voice, often the use of the passive voice, that there was actually hiding all kinds of assumptions. You know, it's there in our disciplines, in anthropology and sociology, the sort of people looking on at these other people and pretending that what they're offering you is objectivity when actually it's their own biases. I think personal writing is really disrupting that and showing that actually putting ourselves in the story is an act of empowerment. Having said that, I think there are instances, because it's become such a fashionable medium, particularly I guess online, where what people are perhaps doing is just telling us something that happened to them, and that there are interesting things about potentially making themselves vulnerable, potentially sort of self-exoticizing, if they haven't got the insight and control of the narrative they're telling. And also that for some people who are early writers, they have this incident or this event that they tell, but once they've told that, the audience who's consuming this thinks, well, that's then done as writers. So attending to the craft of the writing and the fact of that, you know, the researched essay that brings in personal elements, I guess, is the one that I favor, where you start with yourself, you say, look at me, but then you sort of say to the reader, but look also where I'm pointing. I'm pointing at things that you haven't looked at as well. This isn't just about me. It's not a sort of Sunday supplement piece of here's my story, which is not to belittle that type of writing. It's just to say that I worry that it can be susceptible to the old colonial gaze of earlier generations. Yeah, I don't know what the other guys think of that, or whether I'm going off on one.
No, I completely agree with you, Darren, actually. I think that's true. And thank you for your kind words about Afropean, because that is, you know, I think maybe the first draft was, it was full of my hopes and fears, and I went off into crazy tangents. And I think you're allowed to do that in a first draft, but that's not necessarily the draft that other people need to see. You know, I think that personal essay can sometimes be just you know, you write it for yourself to try and, you know, I forget who said it, but, you know, I write to see what I think. And I think that process of writing about yourself can be very good and cathartic. But I think that has to lead somewhere. It has to, I think I'm a big believer in beginning at the personal in order to arrive at the universal. And for me, like, I think I describe my nonfiction as creative nonfiction. So I do some initial research, but never too much. And then because I think it's really important to like leave place to discover, to not try and impose your research upon what you're writing about, especially if it's the kind of book that I wrote. And then you know, you've got to leave the opportunity to change your mind. And then I think when I return, that's when the really deep research begins. For instance, and for me, like a certain kind of symbiosis takes place. It's, you know, I'm taking my ideas, I'm having them challenged. I might meet somebody who'll say something really interesting. And this is what happened with Afropean a lot, is I'd meet someone, I think that was really interesting. And I'd have it all written down. And then afterwards, I could pinpoint that almost in history, or look at the wider, like when I met this guy in Stockholm who was a freedom fighter in South Africa and was in jail in Namibia. And so that's not just his story. I could tell that whole story in the fight for African independence and the fight against apartheid, but I could tell it through this one man's journey. And I love that balance between the personal and the universal.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back to a point that both Darren and Johny that you've made. And also I've just noticed that one of the questions on the chat is, what do our speakers write about? And I shouldn't have made that assumption that people actually are super familiar with what you write. So with, you know, Darren, you said, you know, part of your writing is bringing yourself into the story. And Johny, you said, you know, and you've just reiterated is beginning at the personal and then making it the universal. And so to, you know, Derek, if you want to start this, what do you think you bring personally to your nonfiction? And then all of you can kind of explain what you write about as well in this.
I think it's exactly as Johny described it. I think that's an amazing description, and I'm definitely going to steal it. I think it's, yeah, definitely start a person, arrive at the universal. You know, what I tend to write about a lot is I tend to write about, you know, like adoption, foster care, and mental health. And I feel like using myself as an example and then going on to talk about it broadly and where the system is at right now, where the conversation is at right now, that makes it more impactful. Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I feel like, you know, Darren and Johny definitely covered, you know, that question.
And do you want to tell us a wee bit more about your writing as well, Derek?
Yeah, sure. So I, that's it's a difficult question to answer, because a lot of the time, for me personally, you write what you've been commissioned to write. Obviously, what you want to write. You don't take every commission. Sometimes you just know where your strengths lie. For me personally, my strengths lie in writing about mental health, or writing about young Black boys from like Tottenham, or from Southeast, whatever. Young Black boys who society would see as needing some help or some guidance. And yeah, I think that I would like to broaden my nonfiction writing, but I feel like before I can do that, I need to feel like I have contributed enough to the things that I really care about, that I hold most dear. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean that's pretty much it from me in terms of nonfiction.
Darren?
Yes, so I write, I guess principally I write about dialogue with children. So there's a practice called philosophy with children, which starts with using children's books and then tries to sort of build philosophical conversations in classrooms. So from doing on that, I've done more and more work on children's literature, on representation in children's literature, looking at the sort of history of the representation of Black and Asian people in British children's literature, and how, that sort of golden age of children's literature was the sort of colonial period, and how the legacy of that still plays out in how children's publishing is going. I'm also interested, therefore, with dialogue. So How to Disagree, which I wrote with Adam Ferner, was really a book looking at conversations, but looking at what philosophy, and particularly contemporary philosophy, not going just back to ancient Greek philosophy, what contemporary philosophy can help us to understand about difficult conversations. So I think there's also often a sense, and I think that it's a caricatured sense, that the left is no longer interested in conversations. It's interested in no platforming and cancel culture, etc., etc. And those who seem to have stolen the ground of we're interested in having discussions are often doing it for very political reasons of, the sort of free speech absolutists and libertarians who want to say we're the people who do talk. And actually, I think there's a lot that we can do better around conversations, and also about understanding the pitfalls, like when it's better not to bother with the conversation because the person who claims to want to talk to you is acting in bad faith, has absolutely no interest in listening to you, etc. So I guess the theme of my work, if there is one, is around sort of silences, and I think that probably does go back to my childhood. It goes back to sort of experiences of injustice, but also observing the response to those injustice, which often at home, at school, and in the community was one of silence. And I guess there's a sense of me, wanting to talk about racism, wanting to talk about talk itself and how that could be helpful, wanted to talk about masculinity, and those are the subjects that so far I've written about. But I'm also aware that even saying that makes me vulnerable to a sort of a reading, a sort of pathologization, which I've had in the academy sometimes. Of, well, clearly you're just doing stuff because you've got childhood issues, and be interested to see what the other panelists think of this. But I think that's sometimes an accusation that's thrown, particularly at sort of writers from marginalized communities. But I actually now just think, well, if I'm working through things that I experienced and that gave me some insight as a child, as long as I've worked through them sufficiently to think about them, and it's not just, the first time I'm uttering things, then this is actually a useful process. This is the stuff that writers should be doing.
Brilliant, thanks. Johny?
Yeah, I agree with both what Derek and Darren just said, actually, in lots of ways. I think I'm really interested in the in-betweenness of things. You know, the obvious thing to say is that my mom's white and my dad's black, but you know, I have UK and US, British and US passports. I've spent my life living between the north of England and the south of England. I'm technically a millennial, but my brother and sister are 11 and 10 years older than I am. So so I identify with Generation X. I mean, what's all this generation business about, really? But you know, and I was even born on the cusp of Capricorn and Aquarius, so I'm not even sure what star sign I am. So for me, you know, life, I've grown up feeling that life can never be something that is constructed of binary opposites, and I think that's what I take into all my work. I think no matter who you are or where you're from, you have a unique insight into a specific thing, and I think again, it's that personal to universal. I think once you've worked through your own experience, I think then you can help others either understand that or share that experience with others who have had a similar experience. But I definitely like to play in the blur and find beauty in the blur. I start my book with a quote from Amin Malouf, you know, and he talks about those of us living with plural identities, how we have a role to play in forging links and eliminating misunderstandings, and that's where I see my position is never letting identity get too concrete, you know.
Can I just jump in there to say how much I like that? And I think that's also part of the reason I so enjoyed Afropean. And what you said about binaries, it strikes me that, and this still happens in university, a lot of things that are set up as binaries, there are people just living them as tensions, you know, every day. And you know, it's exploring how those tensions are lived rather than binaries that just little contradictions exist. That I find really interesting. So yeah, thanks. That's helped me think of.
Okay, does anyone have anything more to speak of to that? So I'm going to go back to something that you said, Darren, and actually something you said, Derek, as well, with regards to what you've written. I mean, both of you have written about kind of navigating these masculinity norms. And obviously, Derek, you've said that you've written about your personal experience of this in relation to your own mental health. So since writing these books, and Johny, obviously you'll have experience of this as well, have you seen a shift in attitudes towards notions of masculinity and towards men's mental health?
For me personally, no, I wouldn't say I have. I feel like there's still a lot of work to be done. I think that a lot of the times the questions we ask when it comes to mental health are absolutely redundant. We already know the answer. Like, is there a stigma when it comes to mental health? Yes, there is. We know the answer already. So let's move on to the next thing, you know. And I also think that the conversations we have regarding mental health, I mean, this is obviously my opinion, is that the edges are too rounded, if you know what I mean. I feel like we need to talk about how bad it can get, how serious it can get, you know. We can talk about, you know, the highs and the lows of depression and things like that, or, you know, anxiety disorders, and, you know, and anxiety disorders go quite far, as well as depression. They go to some really dark places. I think we need to talk about the dark places because that's what people really want to talk about. What I've personally found is that when I've written something about mental health that pushes the limits of what we're currently saying, people who are going through the same thing are more open to talk about it. They respond to it a lot better. You know, when I've spoken personally to people who are talking about, for example, their suicidal ideation, and I just ask them the question, what would you do? And then they tell me, and then afterwards they feel better because they've managed to say it out loud. They're like, okay, I've got that out of my system now. Do you see what I'm saying? I feel like those conversations, those difficult conversations need to be had. And I don't think they're happening at the moment. I don't think that anything I write or the next 50 people write will will change that necessarily. I think that it's going to be, unfortunately, a slow, gradual process, because as people, as British people, you know, would rather just not make a fuss about certain things. We're very squeamish about certain things. Do you know what I mean?
Darren, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I guess the book I wrote with Jeffrey Boache was aimed at 9 to 13-year-olds, so it's aimed at a sort of younger audience. And I think I was sort of thinking, well, what would I have liked to know at that age, as well as thinking of, you know, my nephews and kids I've taught. And again, it was largely around a sort of absolute silence. And I think it was happening with racism. It also happens with sexism in schools, that there's an obsession with sort of right conduct. So it's like, you know, these are things you should do, these are things you shouldn't do, these are things you should say, these are things you shouldn't say. But there isn't much recognition that there's actually knowledge to be taught, that you can actually teach about a history of masculinity. You can talk about how it has changed in different times, how it has been, you know, used by different political movements in different ways. So we try and talk about, you know, notions of masculinity under fascism, under communism. And I think that there's actual stuff to study, that there's stuff that kids could know about the world that would be useful. So I guess I'm coming from a different angle today, in that I think that by doing the knowledge stuff, hopefully that will put us in a firmer ground to have some of these other conversations. I guess we didn't talk specifically around mental health in the same way. We were more concerned, as I say, with historicising, and we're also very aware that this is for a young audience, and there are contentious issues. You know, there are notions of, you know, abolishing masculinity, abolishing any kind of gender norms, and there's a sort of, you know, very different political positions on it. But what I did think is that it needs to be a book that is useful to children, you know, whatever their gender, and that gives them some information about the world that the curriculum often doesn't, and encourages them to think about some issues.
Johny, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, you know, I agree with what was said. I think what I like at the moment is that there seems to me to be a bit of a two-pronged attack. I think there are books like Safe, where you having black men talk about their emotions, you know, and then you've got women who aren't asking, who are demanding their space, and bringing the notion of toxic masculinity into the mainstream. So you've got this push and pull factor, I think, which I think is really healthy and liberating, because I grew up, even when you think of like the 90s or even the noughties, you know, if you watch a movie like American Pie, it feels so out of date now, like, and it's so offensive. Whereas at that time it was normalized. American Pie seems bonkers if you watch that film now. It was on the other day, and it's like they just look like narcissists and psychopaths. Whereas at the time, nobody was talking about a movie like that. That was just the normal male identity. So for me, it's a great relief that that there are at least visible options for men to use as their templates now, in a way that I think were more hidden even just 10 years ago. And I think that's because of the work of feminists, really.
Okay, so I've been keeping a wee eye in the chat, and I've been deliberately not asking you questions about your technique, etc., because there are lots of questions there that people are going to ask you in a minute. But I think I'm going to finish with one question. So one last question that kind of links that into it. So all of you, I mean, what all of you write to some extent combines your personal experience with historical, political and cultural commentary. And you, like we said, you all write across different genres, etc. So do you approach your writing, your personal nonfiction writing, differently than you approach your fiction, for example, Derek, your research nonfiction, your academic work, whatever your other writing is, your other forms of writing?
Me personally,
Yeah.
I do. Sorry.
And my sort of add on to that question is, what have you got out next? What are you writing on next?
Oh, okay. Yeah, me personally, I approach it very differently. I try my best to separate myself from like my poetry or the fiction I'm writing, but inevitably my fingerprints are just all over it. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that's difficult. But that approach is that when I'm writing nonfiction, I'm happy to insert myself into the narrative. Fiction, I try not to do that. And just to answer in terms of what I've got coming next, I'm not quite sure at the moment. I'm working on a book with my little brother, trying to get him to read some classics and some poetry. It's called Teaching My Brother to Read. Hopefully it'll be out in 2021 with Murky Books. And after that, I have no idea.
Johnny, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I don't know really. For me, the act of writing is a very mysterious thing. It's something that I've always done, and comes very naturally to me. I'm not saying good writing comes naturally to me, but writing, the act of writing comes very naturally to me. And actually even with my photography, because I do a lot of photography. For me, whether it's the pen or a camera or fiction or non-fiction, it all comes from this place of trying to get something out and then trying to learn something. I think every book is an education. So again, go back to that sort of symbiosis. For me, the act of writing is something that I can't get off, can't let go. It's not like this little obsession, and then I have to try and find a way to send it out into the world and see what the world thinks. And that even happens, like I do write fiction as well, and that even happens with that. I see where it goes, and very often I think in literary fiction what happens is the characters start to speak for themselves, and there is this sort of this embodiment in a certain way where you don't feel like you're in control of them, and I really like that. So I think you start at this position of wonder and wanting to know something, and then you allow that to take roots, and you allow the world to creep in and shape it. And so for me, it all comes from a very similar place, and that's wanting to know something. Sorry, I forgot. I'm the future. I'm working on a project. I can't talk too much about it now, but my next book, I would say, if Afropean was an attempt to reconcile races, my next book is about trying to reconcile generations. It's sort of, that's as much as I can say right now.
Interesting, very interesting. Darren?
What was the first part of that question again now?
How does your writing differ
Right.
from what your process is?
I guess everything I've written is so far has been non-fiction. As I said, it's either been, academic writing for journals or for books, or commercial, as in books that people might read. But I don't think they're sorry, I shouldn't be saying that to you, Mel, as an academic.
It is true.
But as I said, I'd hope that there isn't a huge sort of difference in the language register. Of course, there's probably more citation going on in the academic work, but I want even in my non-academic writing to be crediting the people who I'm taking ideas from. So to be citing them in some sense, and not doing that sort of writing where I pretend that I've invented all these ideas myself. The thing I'm trying to do, and I had some publisher interest, but I've had to sort of pause it whilst I finished my PhD, but it's to write a children's novel. And that's going to be a new task for me, although I've written a lot about children's literature, which partly makes it even harder, I think, because I'm aware of all the things that I wouldn't like about it. but having to write something where it's not clearly my voice saying this is what I think, and not doing that sort of not too good children's writing where one character just becomes the sort of author's voice. I want it to be as multivocal as possible. I want it to be set in London and to be the sort of communities I've been working in for the last 20 years, who are just underrepresented in children's literature, partly I think because so many children's authors live in the countryside and think that's the place of childhood, and that, you know, children are somehow, you know, the sort of Rousseau notion of children are closer to nature, so we should put our stories there. So yeah, that's I guess one project I'm working on, but as I say, rather slowly. I'm also co-editing a book of Welsh writers. I am Indian, South African, Dutch, Welsh Londoner, and I'm interested in Wales, both as the place I was born in, the fact that I'm such a big football fan and have such an affinity with the Welsh football team, and yet such a distrust of nationalism in general, and how the sort of growing Welsh independence movement, how I make sense of that. And we've got a really good team of people together to work on that. And I guess, I mean, I haven't written a book on my own yet. So, you know, everything I've done has been in collaboration, which partly I like, partly I think at some point I need to just, you know, do something on my own. But I like working in collaboration. I've collaborated with people in, you know, a great variety of different people, and I've learned a lot. Again, as a career move and making money, it's probably not great. But in terms of enjoying writing, it's been brilliant.
Okay, so I'm going to just ask one question from the audience. I think it was Andrew, sorry, that asked it, and then I'll leave it to Joy to sort of sift through the other questions. But I think this is relevant because of conversations of inclusion that have been going on, not just for the last few weeks, but obviously for the last few decades. And this is a question for everyone. How do you convince agents and publishers that there's a market for your non-fiction ideas and perspectives? Do you let the work speak for itself, or are there extra layers of explanation and convincing that are required?
There's a quote by Mark Twain that both resonates and infuriates, because it's kind of an oblivious quote, but there's no doubt about the fact that there is some truth in it. And he says, write without pay until somebody offers pay, right? So it's like, you know, which is, you know, unless you're a hedge fund kid, who can really do that, right? But I think what he's getting at, and what I tried to do, is that is create my own space where I could, whether I was getting commissioned or not, hone my craft and get an audience, and we can do that now. And that's what I did. That's the reason I got a book deal, is because I was looking online and wanting to write about the kind of Black experience in Europe, and there wasn't much out there. So I set up this little space that was like a community of, I imagined a community of writers who would, you know, you'd hear about stories about what it's like to grow up Black in Slovakia, or, you know, and so I set up my own space and just began writing in my free time, and and you know, we can do that now. People are starting to pay attention to that, and it is the long game, but I found it very valuable. Something else I would say, and I'm stealing this from Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he said, you know, everybody wants to be a writer when they're 21, 22, and he said, but by the time most people like 27, 28, they fall out, they get bored of it, there's no money in it, and they go to business school. And he said, but if you can just hold on until you're in your mid-30s, the talent pool thins out. Yeah, what happens is, not only by the time you're 35 are you a better writer, not always, but than most 21, 22-year-olds, but all the people who are your age that would have gone on to write have quit. So you're in this nice phase, and I found, as I've hit that age now, I'm at that place where I'm starting to get work finally as a writer, and it's the long game. And I would say this is the sort of advice that I would not have wanted when I was younger, because you want it now, and you're 21, 22, and you've got a lot to say to the world. But what I would say is, set up your own platform, keep writing, do whatever you can, write when others are asleep, and try and survive until you're 35, and by that time you'll become a millionaire like we all are. That's a joke, by the way.
Derek, you want to add anything?
For me, this is a difficult question to answer, just because I feel like I've been very lucky in terms of how I've come into writing. You know, when I was 30, I wasn't a writer. I wasn't trying to be a professional writer until I was about 50. And just by chance, I was having a drink with Yomi Adegoke, and I was just talking about writing, and she was like, she just said, I feel like you're a good writer. She had never seen anything, but she's like, I could just feel it. I feel like you can write. And then we were talking afterwards, and I sent her like a long WhatsApp message about kind of like my life and stuff like that. And the next day she was like, I still read the WhatsApp message you sent me. Like, I knew you could write. And then because she was already about to publish a book, Slay in Your Lane, she was like, I'm going to get you an agent. So she got me an agent. And then she said, I think you should do this book called Safe, because a lot of Black British men are not really being heard right now. I'll help you write the pitch. She helped me write the pitch. We sent it off and the book got published. That's extraordinary. That doesn't happen. Do you know what I mean? So the only advice that I can give is really, from a publishing perspective, because I work in publishing, is really fine tune your pitch as well. And also when it comes to agents, don't just go with any agent. Actually pick your agent. Do you know what I mean? Don't just throw everything out there and see what sticks, because sometimes you'll end up with someone who just needs numbers and they're not really going to help you achieve what it is you need to achieve. Those are the most important ones. And just know exactly what you want to write. Sometimes we have vague ideas and we get excited and we're like, I've got to put this down on paper and get this out. I would say make sure you know exactly what you want to write, how you want to write it. Maybe even have some ideas about who you would like to publish it, like who would be your ideal publishers and why. What books have they published? You know what I mean? Yeah, that would be the best advice I can give.
And get a friend like Yomi, clearly.
Get a friend like Yomi or Musa Okwonga. He's another one who's literally just helped me so much, I would say, yeah, really try and befriend writers, befriend people who are already in the game. Ask them questions, Most of us are very friendly and we'll give you advice and we'll help you where we can. That's what happened with me.
Yeah, can I just jump in?
Sorry, I was just going to do a shameless plug for 2 events that we've got coming up. Meet the agents and meet the authors, that you can get some of this information from as well. Sorry, Johnny, go ahead.
No, well, that's great. Go to those events. I would say that, like, the thing is find a mentor. Really, like, my life changed when I met Carol Phillips, and it amazed me how I sent an email. He didn't know me from Adam. I was a nobody. I sent him his agent an email, realized that he was in Brussels, and we met, and my life changed. So something like, do not be afraid to email the people you admire, no matter how big they are. And usually if they don't get back to you, it's just because their lives are chaotic. But if they, email them a couple of times, and don't feel slighted if they don't get back straight away, but find a mentor. What Derek was saying is really important. I think you'll find with most writers their lives changed when somebody looked at them who was established and said, you're a writer,
Darren?
Yeah, not a great deal to add. I guess on the practical side of the writing bit, I think it's really important, little trusted circle of people who you can share your writing with and give you honest feedback. And I think those people need to be people whose writing you think is good. That you think, well, they know what they're doing as writers. I'll be interested if they tell me, no, actually this bit here isn't all that you will take that and think about it. And it's really difficult getting feedback, particularly I think if you're a writer of color, because a lot of the feedback you get might be just people misunderstanding. So building that little circle of trusted people, and of course, if you can get some really established writers in that circle, yeah, that's going to really help. But even if you can't, if it's people whose writing you value, I think that's really useful. And the other thing I think we've a lot of us have mentioned, that having some kind of platform, I think really helped me to get an agent, because I think writers of color again have to sort of say there is going to be an audience for my stuff, and sometimes have to a bit more of an argument to make for that. And children's publishers, children's agents have said to me, you know, if you're going to put black and brown kids on the cover, it's a harder sell. It might be harder to make the same amount of money. And they acknowledge that as institutional racism. But as someone who wants to represent me, they also are telling me the state of play. So having a platform already where you can demonstrate people are interested in what I have to say, puts you in a stronger position, and definitely treat meeting agents as a mutual interview. It's not about begging to be represented. It's, does this person get me? Because they're probably going to be editing and talking on my behalf. And if I don't feel like they get what I'm trying to do, then, you know, I'm really putting all my work into trusting it with someone who shouldn't be trusted with it.
Right, yeah, hi everyone. I'm just going to come and mention two of the questions. You've been sending through some fantastic questions. And the first one for all of you, Darren, Derek and Johnny, which non-fiction writer would you look to as a role model, or who has inspired you?
Ooh, for me, I would say Jennifer Clement and probably Claudia Rankine. Although what she does is kind of a fusion of different genres, but for me, I would say those two. I feel like Claudia Rankine is able to sum up kind of like the state of race relations in a really profound way, you know, in a way that even though you knew it, it still kind of shocks you. And I feel like we all need that. Although we know what race relations are like in the world, sometimes we fall back because we're so used to it, or we're just kind of exhausted by it. But I feel like Claudia Rankine, especially in Citizen, she'll write something and then you're kind of like, whoa, okay, let me shake this stupor off and get back into trying to fight this. So she's amazing. Jennifer Clement, I would say, just because she's just an incredible writer. Widow Basquiat is one of my favorite books, and I feel like the way she fuses nonfiction with poetry is just amazing. And she's probably one of the biggest influences. Her and Yosa Daly Ward, the biggest influences on my actual novel in verse. That reminds me. So I'll take those two.
Johnny?
Yeah, I would say, you know, on the one hand, if we're talking about literary non-fiction, I would say Carol Phillips obviously is for me a massive influence as a novelist as well, of course. But I think like he's a great essay writer. And I'm also a big fan, and he hasn't done much of his own work. He was the first guy to publish Frantz Fanon, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. He owned a leftist publishing press, but there's just this one book by a guy called Francois Maspero that really sticks with me. It's called Passengers of the Roissy Express, and it was done in like 1990, I believe, or 89, and it's like a look at Paris, but from the point of view of the suburbs, the banlieue. So he's a massive influence for me, that book in particular. And then in terms of like non-fiction, like, I guess, you know, as a public intellectual, is the late Mark Fisher. He's kind of it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, or a buzz name, Mark Fisher. But for me, it's amazing how he can take really mind-bending, difficult concepts and present them in such a compelling way, and always insert the personal. For me, Mark Fisher it was such a devastating loss when we lost him in 2017. But for me, he's the thinker of our times in lots of ways.
Darren?
So I think in terms of philosophical writing that's still readable, Jamaican philosopher Charles Mills, his book The Racial Contract in 1997, I think is a brilliant work that just does so much in quite a small number of pages. The other person who I've always been a big fan of, and then got to meet thanks to Musa Okwonga at the Jallow Prize, is Gary Young. And I just think, you know, whatever's going on in the country, sometimes I just think, right, what's Gary saying about this? Because his take is usually slightly more informed than many people. It sees the bigger picture. he doesn't pull his punches, but he doesn't sort of jump on bandwagons and simply sloganeer. And he also employs humor in really serious pieces in a really effective way, I think. So the fact that I've got to know him a little bit. I mean, when he said that he'd read my essay in the Good Immigrant, my wife, I just stood there sort of speechless for a few minutes, because yeah, he's someone I've looked up to for a long time, and I think he's important for us.
Thanks, Karen, for that question. And Gary kicked off our Take Flight Hub program, and yeah, there was a lot of starry-eyed individuals before, during, and after that session. This question again is for everybody, and this comes from Kerry, and it's, you know, they say that it seemed as if you developed your writing through a non-academic route, but what role or support did you get from the education system, would you say? I'll put that to Derek first.
None. No, that's unfair. From primary, secondary, I don't believe I got any support. I feel like I was kind of put down. You know, I was writing stories when I was in year 4, and I remember writing a long 10-page story, and my teacher picked up the pages and looked at it, didn't read it, and just said, "You have terrible handwriting." And then she went on into assembly and said, "People in year 4 need to improve their handwriting. There's one guy in my class whose handwriting is terrible." And I was just, obviously I didn't write anything again after that. Do you know what I mean? It's only when I got to university that I had an amazing research methods lecturer, Colin Robertson, who encouraged me to read books, read the classics and things like that. And I started doing that, and we started having conversations. He was just recommending me books, would read a book together and discuss it, and blah, 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 blah. And I think if that didn't happen, perhaps I wouldn't be as into literature as I am now, and I probably wouldn't be a writer. So in that sense, you know, it sounds like, I guess, kind of like a Finding Forrester kind of story, you know, but yeah, you do get to university. I think there usually are kind of like 1 or 2 teachers who really believe in what it is that, or they see something in you and then they try and nurture it. Do you know what I mean? I think those are the best teachers. And a lot of, from the people I've spoken to, a lot of those teachers or lecturers are in university.
Thanks, Derek. I'm going to come to you, Darren, as an educationalist. And how would you respond to that question?
So I guess I'm perhaps in a minority in terms of people who turn to teaching, is that a lot of people who become teachers, you know, really enjoyed school and just kind of want to stay there. And I think it's really important that the people who didn't enjoy school or didn't enjoy aspects of it sort of go into teaching as well. There weren't that many people in my school career who I think really took me seriously in my writing. I remember getting into lots of arguments with teachers. I remember writing a really well-crafted review of a hip-hop concert and being told that I should have written about the village fete instead. So it was only really when I got to university that I finally found a few educators who were willing, I guess, to deal with my anger and hang on in there. And having that experience of, you know, when you first try to talk about racism and you haven't really had anyone helping you to do that, your early articulations can be very sharp, not always, you know, perfectly formed. And they can just, a lot of teachers, I think, just, you know, run a mile. And having teachers who stuck by me at university, and it was the second time because I'd already dropped out of university once, that meant that I saw that actually maybe some of the things I was saying were worth sticking with, that there were people who were willing to listen to it. But it, you know, I feel like I was that close to dropping out of university the second time, and, you know, neither of my parents graduated, and the same would have been true for me. Yeah.
Johny, before you actually answer the question, I have to put a comment to you because it's just too genius and lovely. Johny came to my, Nadrika said, Johny came to my secondary school, Abbeydale Grange in Sheffield, and taught me and my classmates how to rap. Thank you. So, keeping with the theme of education, I thought I had to give props to that question and present that to you. So, but yeah, how would you like to respond to that question?
it's kind of really touching to hear. I forgot what's the question again. I was just going to riff off what Derek and
so
said.
Karen was saying that it seems as if your career and writing trajectory wasn't necessarily academically motivated.
Yeah.
So what part, if any, did education play in encouraging and supporting your writing?
Yeah, so like I had a very similar experience to Derek and Darren in that at school, I was almost dissuaded from thinking of myself as a writer. I remember always loving words and trying new words out. And I remember being about 7 years old, and I just heard the word ubiquitous, and so I was trying to use this word ubiquitous in any given opportunity. And my teacher, you know, I plucked up the courage to use it in class because we were talking about oxygen, and I would say, "Miss, is oxygen ubiquitous?" And she said, "John, stop showing off." You know, and I grew up in that culture where it was like, especially being from the north, where it's like if you show any leanings towards anything creative or a little bit different, there's this kind of parochialism where you're sort of showing off. And so I remember being really hurt. I had a friend who was the son of the local vicar, who was white, and he was put in the top class for English at primary school, and I was like put in the bottom. And we both knew that I was the writer. And so, yeah, you know, I had a bad experience in academia. And for me, it wasn't until I found my way to big academic. I almost had to skip a step in a certain way. And when I got to people like, you know, Paul Gilroy or Raymond Williams or even Carol Phillips, for me, that was when my education really began. It's almost like I had to cut out the middlemen and go straight to the real big thinkers. So yeah, you know, thank God for hip hop, because hip hop kept me writing. And then by the time I got sort of into my late teens, I was ready to engage with academia again, but in a very different way.
Oh, well, thank you all for that. We've gone past our allocated 1 hour, but I just have to say thank you so much. That's been absolutely fascinating. Just for the audience members, before we leave, I just want to point out that the link to our event survey will be coming up in the chat in a wee minute. This is specifically for writers of colour, and we'd be really grateful if you could take the time to fill this out. And just a final thanks to the brilliant Darren, Derek and Johny for that super, super interesting and informative conversation. I'm certainly excited to see what you all write next. I can't wait. And of course, thank you so much to the attendees for your contribution. I'm not sure if we answered all the questions, but I'm sure all of you got a lot out of this fantastic conversation. Again, check out our program, Take Flight Hub program, to see if there's anything else you want to come to. And again, thank you very much.